Hi everybody. Welcome back to English 112. This is for our class for Tuesday, the 2nd of February. And where we are is we are transitioning away from some of the foundation readings about what literature is and actually moving to our short story unit. And we will be reading a handful of short stories. Any of those short stories could be possibilities for your journal. If you'll remember, your journal is going to be due at the ending of the short story unit, so you've got a few weeks in order to be able to think about this. And you are being asked to select 3 short stories out of the short stories that we will have read in the unit and write approximately a page or so in response to each of the 3 short stories you choose. So that would be probably 3 pages total, 1 page per short story. And you could deal with each short story as an independent unit, or you can compare and contrast them and talk about them as a whole, whichever you prefer. And the journal can be as long or as short as you'd like it to be. Again, the 1 page per short story is an estimate. And then I just ask that you submit that to me via PDF to my email. I grade it informally. I don't read it for grammar or mechanics, but purely for content. And then I will evaluate it on a checkmark system and then return that back to you. And I'm hopeful that that could assist you with thinking about how you might proceed with your first formal paper, which won't be due until a good probably third of the way of the semester, if not more, when you are going to be asked to write 4 or 5 pages in response to one of the short stories. But we haven't gotten to that point yet. But I mentioned the journal because at this point you can pretty much begin deciding which short stories you think you want to write about. And whenever you've written on 3 short stories, you can submit in your journal early. You don't have to wait until we get to the ending of the unit, though certainly you can wait until we get to the ending of the unit and then make your decisions about that. And in terms of what we have for reading today, you'll notice that there are some readings that you cannot find online, and those are the readings that basically just talk about what literature is and how to go about reading literature. And then the actual short stories themselves, luckily all of them can be found online, and I've included links to all of those short stories. And I'll do the same with the dramas and the poems when we get to that particular point as well. So the first piece of reading that I had scheduled today was for explorations and formulas on page 23 through 30 of the text which I had assigned, the edition I had assigned for this particular class. So your page numbers might be different if you're using a different edition. Again, you wouldn't necessarily be able to find this online. So if it turns out that you don't yet have your text, I'm just going to briefly talk about this, and then you can always go back after the fact and read it. Certainly you can use any of that information throughout the course of the semester. But again, what the textbook is trying to do is to introduce you to how you should go about reading a short story when we actually begin reading the short stories. And if you'll note, I have an optional chat and Zoom on Tuesdays and Thursdays from 1 to 1:30. On Tuesdays, 1 to 1:30 is the optional chat. On Thursdays, from 1 to 1:30 is the optional Zoom, where any of you can elect to interact with me and anybody else who joins on. We can have some sort of a group session. And again, it's not required, so you're not penalized if you don't attend. But I did want to be able to have an opportunity to touch base with you and for you to be able to have an opportunity to touch base with me. And that said, that doesn't mean that you can't make an appointment with me. Or if several of you wanted to get together and find an alternate time for us to meet and have some sort of a group dialogue, that also is another possibility. But right now, my thinking is that the Monday from 1 to 1:30 and the Thursday from 1 to 1:30 is the time that we would be meeting as a group. And in Explorations and Formulas, it talks a little bit about how some short stories and other pieces of fiction are written purely for profit and entertainment, and that those pieces are oftentimes called formula fiction. Sometimes they're called popular fiction as well because they're written for the masses. And the idea behind that kind of reading is that it probably isn't worth much of our time or effort in an academic classroom. It's probably not considered part of the canon, which we had talked about last class, those works considered by scholars and critics worthy of academic study. And you'll remember that we talked a little bit about trying to figure out what makes a work worthy of academic study. And it's a question that we will grapple with all semester long. But if you follow the old dictum of show and don't tell, you can see that there are two pieces that we are studying today, and one is very clearly a piece of literature that is worth our time for academic study, and I believe the other is very clearly a piece of literature that probably is not worth our time for academic study, a piece that's very formulaic. And in fact, formula fiction is more often than not predetermined by publishers and editors, and in terms of the rules that you should follow when you're creating a piece of literature in this genre. So what that means is that much of the creativity is lost. And the textbook highlights a particular kind of formulaic fiction. This happens to be the romance novel, but it could have highlighted any other genre, action, adventure, or horror, or science fiction, or western. And this is in no way to disparage any of these genres, because these kinds of writings are very useful for escapism and for entertainment, but they probably don't do much beyond that. And the example that they give us in terms of a Harlequin romance is one that, if you read romance novels, you're probably pretty familiar with. Starting on page 26, you'll see that there are very specific rules about what you should do with the plot. In other words, after a series of complications, the hero and the heroine should basically find lasting love. And notice that that gender dynamic is usually the only gender dynamic that's found in a Harlequin romance. And love should be the major interest, and it shouldn't be in any way the plot complicated by other factors. The heroine can be a modern American woman between the ages of 19 and 28. In other words, this works very nicely for those readers who want to try to fantasize, and these ages are considered to be the ideal ages for female. And the story would be told in the third person from her point of view, because probably most readers would be female. Again, that's not to negate the fact that others could be reading this as well. But the majority, at least from demographic analysis, has shown that the readers are female for romance novels. She is attractive and nicely dressed, but she's not glamorous, because that's for the other woman, the foil in the piece. And the heroine's personality is spirited and independent, but not pushy or stubborn. In other words, perfect. She's reliant as well as vulnerable, and can have careers such as a nurse or a teacher, an interior designer, a travel expert, a struggling photographer. No menial work, because that's ultimately what the reader might be trying to escape from. She can also be a doctor or a lawyer or another professional, but her work can't define her life, because if it did, then she wouldn't have the time or the energy to be able to pursue a romantic relationship, which is really what the whole point is. And then the hero can be approximately 10 years older than the heroine, foreign or American. Doesn't have to be handsome in a traditional sense, but he must be strongly masculine, tall and well built, and he looks terrific in a three-piece suit as well as in sports clothes. In other words, the man that can be taken anywhere. And he also has an affluent lifestyle. He's very successful professionally and financially. Again, this is very useful for escapism. His past can be somewhat mysterious or shrouded by a painful moment, maybe a death of his spouse, or perhaps a divorce. But chronic problems such as alcoholism or drug addiction or sexual dysfunctions are not discussed. Again, because those wouldn't help with the escapism element. And then we have secondary characters who are just that, secondary, whether it be the other woman who's the foil, the other man who usually is supportive of the heroine, or some sort of selfish individual who's scheming and ultimately will not be successful with his scheming. And then other characters, almost like the extras in a movie, the nosy neighbor, for instance. Settings, usually contemporary, romantic, and exciting. New York City, London, Paris, Rio, the mountains, the ocean. I like to joke, no offense to anyone in Greenfield, but probably Greenfield, Massachusetts would not necessarily be the setting for a romance novel because it would probably not be considered to be sophisticated enough or exotic enough. Love scenes, they can occur before marriage. Neither is promiscuous, and description should appeal to the senses, but they shouldn't be overly detailed or graphic because that gets us into another genre known as porn. And then the writing piece, which is the piece that makes this English teacher sad. Avoid complex sentences, very long paragraphs, and lengthy descriptions. Use concise, vivid details to create the heroine's world. Be sure to include full descriptions of the hero and heroine's physical features and clothes. Allow the reader to experience the romantic mood. Dialogue should sound like ordinary conversation. The overall writing should be contemporary English without slang, difficult foreign expressions, strange dialects, racial epithets, or obscenities, although hell and damn and a few other mild swears are fine. And the length? Somewhere between 55,000 to 65,000 words in 10 to 12 chapters. And I always think about that when someone asks me how long their paper should be. And I understand why that question comes up because it gives you an idea of how much time and effort to put into the paper. But can you imagine telling a great artist how many colors they should use in their painting? Or a musician, how many notes they should use in their composition? And it's the same here. A writer should use as many words as necessary in order to be able to create a good piece of writing. And that said, I understand that, again, 4 to 5 pages, for instance, our first paper might give you a sense of how much effort and time to put into it. But it's oftentimes misunderstood, and what people hear is that they need to have enough words to fill 4 or 5 pages, not necessarily enough ideas to fill 4 or 5 pages. Those are two separate things that we will talk about. And the first short story, which actually wasn't even a short story, it happened to be a chapter from a romance novel, A Secret Sorrow. A novel I've never read. I suspect most of you, maybe all of you, have never read. And yet we have a short summary on the top of page 31 about what's happening. We get 10 chapters summarized in just a few sentences, and we're able to jump immediately into the novel. This is not a good sign that you can summarize something that simply and we don't feel as if we've missed anything at all. And what we see is a lot of melodrama, as we've got Kai and Faye basically arguing with one another, a couple, and then we find out that the cause of the argument happens to be because Faye is infertile and believes that they can no longer pursue their relationship. And then after a series of backs and forths, I can summarize this for you. Kai says, "We'll adopt." Faye says, "Really?" Kai says, "Sure." And they adopt and they live happily ever after. And not to in any way indicate that or to suggest that this is not a serious topic that many couples face, but the fact that it can be solved in just a few minutes should be a warning sign, or I should say can be solved in just a few paragraphs, should be a warning sign that we don't have a whole lot of depth and a whole lot of complexity to this particular piece. So when we're talking about something that's formulaic, in other words, it follows a formula or a pattern, so you can already predict the ending. Or we talk about something that's popular, and the sense that it's popular is that it appeals to large groups of people, probably again because it is focused mostly on entertainment and escapism and profit. Not to say that pieces of complex literature can't provide escapism, they do. And that's not to say that complex pieces of literature can't provide profit to the authors, because they can, and they certainly did to Shakespeare. And that's not to say that great pieces of literature can't provide escapism, and because they can. But I think you'll see that great pieces of literature, as many of you indicated in your responses to the attendance question, have a certain level of depth and sophistication, and also tend to try to make some sort of a statement about the world. And what we will end up finding is that the pieces of literature we're reading over the course of the semester, I think, do satisfy that. That said, you don't necessarily have to agree with the statement that the author is trying to make, but what you do want to do is make sure that you can at least identify the reason why the author is writing this particular piece and what it is they're trying to get us as reader to think about in the creation of their piece. And when we look at the second reading that was assigned for this class, A Sorrowful Woman, and this is on page 39. They both have similar titles, but this is a very different kind of reading. So at this particular point, what my hope is that you've already read A Sorrowful Woman, so that when I post these videos based on particular readings, you would have done those readings prior to the video. Again, I'll be asking attendance questions at the ending of the video, questions that don't necessarily have right answers, questions that just are going to provoke conversation, discussion. And I'm very hopeful that not only do you respond, but that you also read the responses of your classmates and my responses as well, because that will give you a sense of what we might have dialogued about when we were in class. And if it occurs to you as you're reading somebody else's response that you wanted to make a reply, certainly you could. Much like in class, you could raise your hand to make a response, but you're not necessarily required to. But A Sorrowful Woman, my suspicion is that you probably read it and then you needed to reread it, and perhaps even reread it again. And in other words, it is not an easy read in the way A Secret Sorrow was, where you could easily read it and in fact miss passages and you would still understand what was going on. Right from the very beginning of A Sorrowful Woman, we're left with questions. And those questions won't necessarily be answered until we get to the end. And then we probably have to reread now that we know the ending so that we can go back and understand what some of the clues were throughout the story. A piece of literature I usually suggest is something that should be read 3 times. The first for plot, simply what's happening. The second for interpretation, to try to understand why those things are happening. And then a third time shortly before you're going to write about it or talk about it in class so that you can refresh your memory. Though I am a realist and I know that sometimes it's just not possible to be able to read something multiple times. But obviously each time you read something, you will be able to get new meaning from it. And maybe that's my definition of literature, is that each time you read it, you get new meaning. Because once we've read something like a newspaper article, we don't need to read it again because we already understood it. And once we read a piece of popular fiction or formula fiction, something like A Secret Sorrow, there probably isn't a need to reread it again because we understand the plot. That's not to say that it hasn't been studied in academic ways. There have been a good number of feminists who have read romance novels to talk about the way that gender is portrayed, particularly the female gender, and how that influences our behaviors and our values and our beliefs and our attitudes as a society. So it is possible, but the piece wasn't really written for any kind of in-depth analysis. And A Sorrowful Woman is the exact opposite. And in terms of A Sorrowful Woman, I wanted to talk a little bit about how to go about reading a piece of fiction. And one of the readings that I had assigned today was about writing about fiction, which eventually you will be doing both in journals and with the paper. And that appears on page 46. This is something that, again, would not be found online. But these are questions that could be useful to you, not only when you're writing about literature, but also when you are reading literature, to try to consider what might be important. So starting on page 47, there are multiple questions about plot, or in other words, what's happening. Does the plot conform to a formula? Is it predictable? What is the source and nature of the conflict of the protagonist? There has to be some sort of conflict or tension in a story. And the protagonist would be the main character, as opposed to the antagonist, which is usually the enemy or the foil to the protagonist. Is the story told chronologically? And if it's not, there's probably a reason why. What does the exposition reveal? In other words, the background information that we're given about the characters. Is the conflict resolved at the end? And that tension may not necessarily be resolved. Is the plot unified? In other words, does everything fit together? Are all of the incidents somehow or another connected? And then character. Do you identify with the protagonist? In other words, the main character of that particular story. And who or what is the antagonist or the foil? An antagonist doesn't have to be human. It can be, for instance, an animal or even Mother Nature. For instance, Jack London oftentimes portrayed the antagonist as nature itself. Does your response to the characters change over the course of the story? And if so, why? Are they round characters? Are they flat or stock characters? In other words, are these characters that have a certain level of depth and complexity to them? Or do they seem very simplistic and stereotypical? How does the author reveal the elements of these characters, and what is the purpose of the minor characters? Setting, or where the story takes place. How is the setting important to the story? So if we're given details about where a story is taking place and when a story is taking place, those are probably important. Is the setting used symbolically? In other words, is it used as a representation of something else? Is the setting used as a kind of antagonist, as I was suggesting that the antagonist doesn't necessarily have to be human? Point of view, who is telling the story? So if we're getting the story told through the first person or the I, much like when you interact with somebody and they are telling you a story, you know that one individual can perhaps distort or manipulate. Or is the story told by the third person? Is it more omniscient, so that it's basically an author commenting on what is happening to the characters themselves? Is the narrator reliable and objective? Remember, I narrators, it becomes really tricky as to how reliable or objective they might be. Does the author directly comment on the actions? And if the story was told from a different point of view, how would your response to the story change? Symbolism, or again, representations. How do symbols contribute to your understanding of the story? Themes or major truths that are found in a particular piece. Did you find a theme or multiple themes? Are they stated directly or are they implied? Is the theme a confirmation of your values, or does it challenge your personal values as a reader? The style of the writing, that's the diction or the language that's being used. The tone, the feeling of the story, is it happy or is it sad? And irony, and that's usually a twist, something that's unexpected. But not as in unexpected in that, oh, I didn't think that it would rain today, and it did rain today, so that was unexpected. What would be ironic is that the day that I decide to leave my umbrella home is the day that it rains. So irony is something that has some sort of a twist. And probably the best example that I can give you of irony appeared actually in a television show, The Twilight Zone. And I don't know if you're familiar with the original series, The Twilight Zone, but basically some of the best short story writers of the day actually wrote for The Twilight Zone. And in this particular story, Time Enough at Last, there's a man, and perhaps you've seen this piece, who is basically working at a bank, and he's sort of a henpecked husband. And all he wants is time to read, but he can't read at work, and he can't read at home. At work, he's supposed to be doing his job, and at home, he's supposed to be doing chores. So, and he also isn't terribly competent, so that at one point during work, at the ending of the day, when everyone is gone, he locks himself accidentally into the vault. Which ends up being a blessing for him, because it turns out while he's locked in the vault, there's nuclear war, and it destroys all of the society around him. And he emerges from the rubble because he was safe, because he was in the vault. And at first he's horrified at the destruction that he sees. And then he becomes rather pleased, realizing that now he has time enough at last to read. He doesn't have a boss or a wife who would prevent him from reading. So he crawls over to the ruins of a library. And again, we probably have to suspend a little bit of disbelief that the books would actually survive a nuclear blast, but they do. And then he piles up a group of books in order to read them. And it just so turns out that he is wearing glasses, and they're very thick glasses, the old-fashioned kind of glasses that were made out of glass rather than plastic. And as he leans down to look at the books, the glasses slide off of his face, fall to the ground, and shatter. So basically, he has time enough at last to read, but he can't see. And that's probably the best example that I can think of in terms of irony, or that twist ending. And then moving on to how does the author's use of language contribute to the story itself, and the question that I suggested to you. Do you think the story is worth reading more than once? And then the last set of questions on page 49 is asking you about critical approaches that might be useful for a piece. If you remember, we talked about this last class, where we had talked about biographical critics would focus on the biography of the author and how that helps to inform our understanding of a text, while historical critics would focus on the history of the time the piece takes place in and or the time in which the piece was written, and that can be the same or different, and that will inform your reading of the piece. And a psychological critic would focus on the psychology of the characters themselves in the piece, or perhaps the author of the piece, or perhaps even the readers of the piece, and that would help inform or the reading of the piece. So they're asking, is there a particular critical approach to the story that you are reading that perhaps lends itself well to this, perhaps biographical or historical? And to what extent do your own experiences and values and beliefs and assumptions inform your interpretation? What kind of evidence from the story are you focusing on? You're almost like an attorney, basically, and you're picking and choosing the pieces of evidence that will support your case. And again, if you think about attorneys, a good attorney can take either side, the defense or the prosecution. And it's the same evidence. They're just picking and choosing those pieces of evidence that are going to strengthen their case for the particular position that they're arguing. And then the judge and perhaps a jury makes a decision based on the way the evidence was presented. And you're doing something very similar when you are interpreting literature. You're taking a position and then you're finding pieces of evidence to support that position, and you're putting forth that position. And I suppose that I could be considered the judge, so to speak, the reader of the paper. And the good news is that there doesn't necessarily have to be one verdict the way there does in a courtroom, in that I can get multiple papers that each are about the same piece but come to very different conclusions, and all of them can be A or excellent papers, as long as there's evidence in the text to support what it is you're saying. So it doesn't even have to be something that's correct or even probable. It just has to be possible, assuming that you've got evidence in which to support what you're saying, which is one of the reasons why English majors being an English major is so common for individuals who are contemplating law school, because you're utilizing many of the same skills. Now, obviously, these are a lot of questions that I just reviewed, 33 actually. It's not as if you could answer all 33 in a journal, or that you should ask yourself all 33 of these questions as you're reading. But just keep these questions in the back of your mind so that when you are beginning to read short stories, and then eventually drama and eventually poems, you can perhaps remember some of these questions, and this might help to inform how you go about interpreting a piece. The good news about reading the stories from the text is that the textbook gives a series of questions at the end as well for most of the pieces. And these are questions you can also ask yourself to consider as you are reading a piece, that are specific questions to that piece. Or you could also perhaps address one or two of these questions in a journal if you so wanted to, and you'll see that I might perhaps address some of these questions as well. So in terms of reading what, or thinking about what literature isn't written primarily for profit, the way formulaic writing is. Literature is not predictable or trite or formulaic. There's a certain level of creativity there and originality. Literature is not usually something that can be classified by a specific genre, such as Western or sci-fi. However, we'll see how Shakespeare broke some of these rules, in that he was able to write by specific genres or categories, comedies, tragedies, histories, but yet he still had creativity. And while he was writing for profit and he did earn money, there's also such a level of depth and sophistication in Shakespeare's works that there was more than just the profit motive. And literature doesn't have necessarily strict rules for how to write plot or create characters, or how to go about the setting or the love scenes or the writing, the length, or anything of that nature. And on page 50 of your textbook, if you are curious, they give you a sample paper in progress. Now, we haven't gotten to the point where we're writing a paper yet. In fact, we haven't even gotten to the point where we would be writing a journal. That said, you can see that what the individual is doing is they're writing a first response to A Secret Sorrow and A Sorrowful Woman, the two pieces that I had assigned for today. And first, what we've got here is what looks like on page 50 a journal response to the two about how the reader felt about these pieces, whether they enjoyed them or didn't enjoy them, and why. And then on page 51, we'll see that that reader took their journal and they ended up creating a sample brainstorming list where they showed the similarities and the differences between the two. And then they took that list of ideas that they were able to generate and part from their journal to, on page 53, begin to write a draft of something that looks like a paper, something that's got sentences and paragraphs. And that's not to say that it's in any way done, because if you were to go to page 56, you'll see that there's lots of edits there, things that are crossed out, or things that are added in, or things that are moved to different locations. In other words, you're doing the paper in steps or stages until you get to the final draft that you actually submit in. And the best way to do this is over a longer period of time rather than trying to do it all at once. And I mentioned this even though we haven't talked about how to write a paper yet, because if you are thinking about writing about one of the short pieces, you should begin thinking about ideas sooner rather than later. And certainly you don't want to wait till the very day that it's due to begin the construction of the writing. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the last story that we had assigned today for A Sorrowful Woman. And again, it definitely is a very different kind of piece than what we were reading with A Secret Sorrow. It has depth and it has complexity, and it's not necessarily predictable. And I wanted to talk about how to read correctly, because oftentimes people just begin with the first sentence and they don't pay attention to things like author or date or title, and all of those things are extremely important. So, for the story A Sorrowful Woman on page 39, begin with the author, Gail Godwin. And we have a picture. And from the picture and the name, we can assume that this is a female author. We could be wrong, but it looks like we've got a female, and this might be important. And we have the date of birth, 1937. This will also be important, as well as the date in which the story was written. A Sorrowful Woman was written in 1971. So any information or knowledge that we have about the 1970s and also the 1960s would be very useful to us in terms of understanding this particular story. We get a little bit of information about the author, and this is something certainly you can look up on your own as well, but it's very nice that the textbook has provided this, about where she studied: the University of North Carolina, the University of Iowa. She earned a PhD in English in 1971. That would have been rather difficult for a female to do. It's rather difficult to get a PhD in the first place, but especially for a female in the 1970s. She won multiple grants and awards, which goes to show that she has a certain level of status in her profession, and she's got a certain level of talent as well. And we look at the title, and we may not understand what the title means until actually we get to the ending of the story. But at this point, to think about A Sorrowful Woman. So the first word is A, not the sorrowful woman, but a sorrowful woman. And there is a difference between the, when you're talking about one thing, and a, which could be one of many. Sorrowful. And the question is, why the sorrow? And again, we won't know until we read. And woman. Not man, not child, not person, but woman. So how could that be important, especially written in 1971? And I'm assuming the United States, unless I read the story and I'm given information that it's occurring elsewhere. And in fact, we don't even begin with the story. What we have is an opening line. Once upon a time, there was a wife and mother one too many times. So the question is, why is it that the author begins with this line? Once upon a time, there was a wife and mother one too many times. And then as we read the story, we get information about what's happening. In terms of the plot, that's probably our first reading and the easiest reading. But even the plot can be confusing. For instance, if you've read the short story, you may not have realized that the woman, who was never named, by the way, and that'll be important that none of the characters are named, the woman commits suicide at the ending of the story. And I know some of you are listening to this right now and say, what? I read the story and I didn't know that. Oh, yes, she did. It's not directly stated, it's implied. In other words, you have to read it very, very carefully. And you can see that on page 43, there are some questions at the end. For instance, how do the two women's attitudes differ about marriage in A Secret Sorrow and A Sorrowful Woman? Or how is the woman's problems in A Sorrowful Woman, how are her problems made more complex than in A Secret Sorrow? What is the theme or the central meaning in each story? To what extent might A Sorrowful Woman be regarded as an unromantic sequel to A Secret Sorrow? So that question might give you a little bit of a hint of what to think about as you're reading. Could contrast what marriage means in the two stories. Discuss your feelings about the woman in A Sorrowful Woman. How does she remain a sympathetic character in spite of her refusal to be a traditional wife and mother? It may take more than one reading of the story to see that Godwin does sympathize with her. So this is an incredible amount of information we're given in question 10 on page 43 about A Sorrowful Woman, in that the main character, the sorrowful woman, is supposed to be a sympathetic character, even though she refuses to be a traditional wife and mother, and that this is what Godwin, the author, wanted us to feel towards her. And that said, I thought that what would make sense at this point is my asking you to reread A Sorrowful Woman. That's on page 39 to 43. And you can see that I've included a link to that story online. So if it turns out that you don't have your textbook, you can find that story online. And then we could talk about it in greater depth next class. I also wanted to revisit The Story of an Hour on pages 15 through 16 next class. And that was embedded in the earlier set of readings about how to read literature. But now that we've talked about how to actually pay attention to a piece of writing, I wanted us to read that story and to analyze it. And you can see that I've also found a link for The Story of an Hour, so that if you don't have your textbook, you can at least reference that particular piece, as well as continue to talk about reading and the writing process. So our attendance question, and this would be due on Wednesday, the 3rd of February at 10 a.m. Why do you think A Sorrowful Woman begins with the opening statement, and that's called an epigraph, by the way, that reads, quote, "Once upon a time, there was a wife and mother, one too many times," unquote. And again, why do you think A Sorrowful Woman begins with the opening statement that reads, "Once upon a time, there was a wife and mother, one too many times"? And again, you can see this in the notes that I've posted underneath our video. So I hope you're all doing well. I'm doing well. And next class, we'll talk about A Sorrowful Woman and also The Story of an Hour, as well as continue to talk about things like writing about literature and journals. Take care. Bye-bye.